Hi, this is Sean McGee from European News Weekly. I'd like to bring you to an interview with Professor Chris Busby, who's been involved with the British nuclear test veterans case in the High Courts in the UK. Now, he has a small team of people helping him. He's been taking a huge workload on and being put up against a much larger judicial side. So there's a lot of people who are working to prove their point, and Chris and just a few people are managing, in my opinion, to prove theirs. But what I'd like to do, I'll bring Professor Chris Busby, who's very kindly decided to have a brief talk about this as much as he can, given the situation that there's a court case going. We can have a small update with some details, and we're just going to bring that to you now. So, Chris, you've just finished this week with a court case, I believe, and it was another stage of a multi-year sort of process that we've discussed in the past. Would you like to bring us to what might have happened that you can tell us that happened in the court, and what the judge's findings are?
Right. Well, we were on up in the Royal Courts of Justice, and the main purpose of the hearing was to discuss the various disclosure requests that we had made. That's we want to have information about the nature of the bombs, and particularly the substances which were present in the fallout, and also we are asking for disclosure of documents which tell us about the genetic damage in the children of the veterans. There's a lot of data in the University of Dundee that they're not releasing. So, I mean, basically, if you have a case in which you're trying to prove that your people have got cancer or had cancer as a result of their exposure to radiation, then you might want to get hold of all the documents that exist in the records that showed that radiation existed at the time, and that they measured various levels of radiation on Christmas Island at the test site there, and also at Maralinga in Australia, so that you could say, well, tribunal judge, that here is evidence that these people were exposed to radiation, and this is the amount of radiation, and this is the evidence that shows that it causes cancer. But all along, right through the whole series of trials and tribunal hearings that have existed right back to 2009 or earlier, it's been impossible to get the Ministry of Defence to release documents which they clearly have, which say how much radiation, how much radionuclide concentrations there were in these various bombs. Particularly what we want to know, because our interest is to shift the argument away from radioactive exposure in terms of dose towards exposure in terms of inhalation of these alpha emitters like uranium and the two beta emitters, tritium and carbon-14, which are all three of those substances were not really measured at the time, because the Geiger counters that they used to ensure that people were not being overexposed just don't detect alpha particles. They don't detect those soft beta emitters like carbon-14 and tritium. So, and yet it's quite obvious that the people who were doing the tests must have measured this stuff. So we just wanted to get hold of data that showed what they'd measured, but they just wouldn't give it to us, you see. So we asked the judge to force them to give it to us. So that's what this is about. It's about disclosure. So the judge says, well, you have to give them what they want, and they say, well, we're not going to. And so that was essentially what the arguments were on that day. And in my opinion, we made quite reasonable advance on a couple of fronts. I mean, the most important thing that happened, to my mind, was it became quite clear as a result of the document that the order that the judge eventually produced after the hearing. It became quite clear that the judge has figured out what the essential argument is in the case. And this is quite a breakthrough, because in the past the cases have always been associated with ionizing radiation exposure as measured by absorbed dose, so many millisieverts this and so many millisieverts that. And I have always argued that for internal radiation you can't use dose, so we have to deal with the actual amounts of substances that were there that could have been inhaled by these people. And the most important one of these, of course, is uranium for us. So we're arguing that uranium is important. I mean, the bombs were made of uranium. I mean, that's what atomic bombs are made of. The hydrogen bombs have got a casing of depleted uranium to reflect the neutrons back into the fissile center, so that the neutron density is very high, and you get fusion, which produces the thermonuclear explosion. That's how you do it. Okay, so there's tons and tons of uranium in these bombs, and according to Glasstone, there's about 1 ton per megaton. So in other words, if you have a 3 megaton thermonuclear weapon like the one at Christmas Island, the big Grapple Y one, you're talking 3 tons of uranium. So that goes bang, and it all showers down as little particles, and then the men can inhale it, or it comes down in the rain and the men can inhale it, and it becomes incorporated into the soil, and then it's resuspended and the men can inhale it. And so this is, but at the same time you can't measure it with a Geiger counter, because as I know, having been to Iraq and Kosovo looking for uranium is an alpha emitter, and it's really quite hard to find. And if somebody's totally contaminated with uranium all over his body, like one of our men, one of the appellants, Don Battersby, was given the job of cleaning down aircraft which had flown through the mushroom cloud, and a lot of that material would have been uranium. You see, 99% in terms of mass is uranium. Anyway, so that was the first thing that the judge obviously has figured out, that this is we're now into new territory, because the ICRP risk model, the one that has been hitherto used in order to assess the dose and therefore the probability of getting cancer, that model doesn't work for uranium, because uranium binds to the DNA. And he's figured all of this stuff. And I'll read you some of his reasons, because he gives reasons for what he's going to do. And what he's done is he said, okay, we're going to ask the Ministry of Defence to give us everything they've got that Dr. Busby wants, and then they say, well, we haven't got anything. We've looked as well as we can, and we can't find anything. But we did find some things, but the things that we found, they then said were top secret, and they weren't going to give them to us, because if they gave them to us, it would break the Official Secrets Act, and they would be releasing stuff into the public domain that might help a terrorist to make a bomb. So that's the essential argument. But the judge says, but on the other hand, if Dr. Busby needs that information to make his case, then we will ask you to give it to him. So at that point, the Ministry of Defence, the Secretary of State for Defence's lawyer, his QC, he gets up and he says, well, in that case, we're going to ask for a public indemnity certificate, and we're going to argue in court that it would affect Britain's status as a world power, or it would affect, the ability of terrorists to make bombs, that sort of thing. So that will be argued out in a new court, which I think involves the House of Lords. So it's quite a heavy thing. So then the judge said, well, all right, well, we don't want to go down that route unless we have to, and so what we're going to do is we're going to ask Dr. Busby to try and get another scientist, a chap called Professor Regan, who has got security clearance, to go and have a look at these secret documents and see if he can turn them into some form that the Ministry of Defence thinks is not going to, affect their position in terms of secrecy quite so much. So instead of saying, like, the amount of uranium here is like 450 kilograms, they will say something like, oh, it's between 200 kilograms and 900 kilograms, that kind of thing, you see. And so that the judge is just going to, and then when that's done, assuming that all gets done, the judge will then ask me whether I think that that's good enough to make my case, and I'll either say yes or no, depending upon what they do, you see. And if I say no, then of course it will have to go to this PII thing. So that will be quite a heavy thing. That will.
That's the House of Lords, basically.
I think so. I'm not really a lawyer on that sort of level, so I'm not entirely sure. But it's some very, very high up tribunal that I think involves law lords, or Supreme Court, or whatever they call it nowadays. So that's the deal in terms of the disclosure. And the other thing is that he's going to order disclosure on is he's going to order the Environment Agency to provide for me all of the data they have relating to the material that was repatriated from Christmas Island in 2007, I think it was. They went over there and they did various surveys, and they found a lot of radioactive stuff there, and they put it all in drums and brought it all back to England and buried it at Teesside, at Port Clarence, on Teesside. So all that stuff was buried up. So there's a lot of radioactive stuff up there. But do you know, I just can't get any data on what was in it. I mean, obviously they measured what was in it and they did all sorts of gamma spectroscopy and this and that, but I haven't been given the results. So he's asking the Environment Agency to give me those results, or ordering them to. And then the third thing that he's ordered is the release of the data from the University of Dundee for the genetic damage study that was done by Sue Rabbit-Roff in 1998. The British Nuclear Test Veterans Association had a questionnaire study that was run by this journalist woman called Susan Rabbit-Roff, and it was funded by Catherine Cookson, who writes the novels. Quite, I think, £100,000 or something she paid for this, and that data was all collected by Rabbit-Roff, and then she wrote a paper on it. But the paper, well, it's not worthless, but it doesn't really have any numbers. It just says, this is very bad, and oh dear, that was very bad, and they seem to have an awful lot of this sort of genetic damage and so forth. There were no numbers, no real numbers that enable us to do any statistics, you see. So some time ago I asked the BNTVA if I could have that data, and they gave me a letter of authority to get hold of it from the University of Dundee, but the universities refused to release it then, and so I've asked the judge to order them to release it. And they have already said that if he orders them to release it, they're going to go to the Scottish House of Lords, what they call the Court of Appeal, Court of Sessions. And so they're also going to refuse to release this stuff. So it's all quite a big punch-up.
So
anyway,
in terms of releasing that particular document from Dundee, then, of course, what we do know is that the British government has basically offered the British nuclear test veterans roughly about 20-odd million pounds for the damages, genetic damages over 10 generations, I believe it is.
Well, I have heard that, but then on the other hand, I've also heard that isn't the case. So I'm not quite sure. I wouldn't like to say that that's true.
Well, it was the British nuclear test veterans when they actually did their report on their website. That did crop up, but whether it's there still, I don't know.
Well, I think that one of the solicitors who was working in the previous cases investigated it and said that actually nobody's offered them anything. But if they had offered them 20 million, it wouldn't be very much money compared to the number of offspring that have got genetic damage,
Sure, and the fact is that this has been well publicised in the media of the 20 million offer.
Yeah. Okay. Anyway, so if I can, I've got here the order, and at the end of the order it says reasons for the decision, and I'll read you a little bit of that because actually it's extremely important and interesting because it takes us forward into completely new territory with regard to this business of the test veterans, and so what I'll just read you a few lines from it because they show you the sort of way in which the judge is thinking, and I'm absolutely amazed and tremendously happy that this judge has actually figured out what it is that I'm trying to say. Because I can tell you that in all of the other previous arguments, and I put these arguments before the upper tier as well, before Sir William Charles, and honestly, they couldn't figure out what it was that I was trying to say, but eventually it sunk in. So here we are, number 6 in this reasons. He writes, this is Sir Nicholas Blake. He writes, the explosions were the products of devices composed of fissile material, including uranium or plutonium, surrounded by tamper material, including depleted uranium and chemical explosive. A consequence of the explosions is ionizing radiation through alpha, beta, and gamma rays, or neutron radiation. Well, we all agree that, but anyway. He goes on. 7. Dr. Busby, who now represents the appellants Battersby and Smith, raises a number of new points not previously determined. So, we're in new territory now. See, 1. Uranium and other elements released by detonation are a source of risk to human health by means that are not identified in conventional measurements of ionizing radiation as above, and in particular a source of damage to the DNA systems of the human body. 2. The International Radiation Protection Authority's guidance on the safe maxima for exposure to ionizing radiation is insufficient to screen out all risks to human health arising from explosions of the kind undertaken in Maralinga and Christmas Island. In particular, those who are assessed to have received a radiation dose of less than 100 millisieverts may still develop cancer or other medical conditions as a result of exposure to the product of the explosions. 3. Since uranium damage may not be identified in traditional monitoring methods or assessments, it is necessary to assess the likelihood of risk by other means, including A. the quantity of uranium used to make the device, either as the core charge or the tamper material, the amount of residue measured after the explosion, and B, epidemiological data about clusters of genetic disorders suffered by service personnel who have been exposed to the product of an explosion. I mean, so those three things are essentially my core case. And this is the first time I've seen them written down, and this is the first time that this will appear in this form in a major trial. Well, not a trial, this is a tribunal, but effectively it's a trial in the High Court in London.
Yeah.
So that item 7 is really an amazing advance. We now have identified 3 absolutely new areas where we are arguing stuff which are putting arguments away from this idea that the absorbed dose was too low to cause cancer. I mean, what I'm saying is, of course, dose doesn't work for internal radiations, and therefore, what would have been considered to be low dose is actually quite capable of causing cancer, and this is what the judge has figured out, and he's written it down. So that's hurrah for the judge,
So obviously, in terms of that particular report from Dundee, then, which would certainly put a lot of weight to some of those 3 points. If they manage to block it, which they're obviously they've said they're going to. So if they do manage to block it, what would be your backup? Where would be your backup?
Well, of course, I've got my own study. There was the study that we did of the same people, of the British Nuclear Test Veterans Association.
Sure.
And that study was published in the peer review. But of course, the problem is that the judge in the upper tier now says that Busby can't be an expert. I mean, so they might well see. I mean, I can see that Heppenstall, the Secretary of State lawyers will come along and say, well, okay, there's this other study by this bloke Busby, but we're not allowed to look at anything by Busby because he's not an expert, because he's been ruled out by the upper tier. You see, so that's why this other stuff is quite important. So we can we can get somebody else to analyse that, and then they'll say, well, in the witness box then, and I'll call them, and then they'll say, hey, this shows that these genetic disorders were caused because, after all, the point is that if I said to the judge, I mean, I actually said this in the while I was arguing all this stuff in the High Court, I was standing up there, like Perry Mason or somebody. And I said, look, if everybody had a little dial on their head which registered genetic damage and radiation, and registered radiation, with a little red mark that said, if you get into this part, something bad will happen, then it would be great. We wouldn't have to worry about this. We could just get all the test veterans and have a look at the dial on their head, and then we'd say, well, look, they got exposed to radiation. But we don't. But in a sense, I said, well, my lord, there is a way in which we can do this by retrospectively looking at their genetic damage through the effects on their children. Because after all, genetic damage is not a disease that you can catch, So if they were all stationed at Christmas Island and all of them, or a very high proportion of them, or much higher proportion of them than should have, got children with genetic deformities and holes in their heart and spina bifida and hydrocephalus and all of the stuff that we found, then it's kind of retrospective or objective evidence that they were exposed to something that causes genetic damage. Now, what else could it be but their radiation exposure at Christmas Island? Because that's the only thing that they shared. Apart from that, once they left the National Service, they were butchers and bakers and candlestick makers and all different people. So the only thing that they shared that they had in common was the time that they spent at the nuclear test sites. And look here, they've all got children with 2 heads. Anyway, so obviously that he took that on board and accepted that epidemiological data, as he writes about clusters of genetic disorders, is actually an objective indicator that they were exposed, whatever their dose was. Do you see?
Yeah. So that sort of makes it a little bit easier for you to say.
Well, it's very good. It's very good because Stubbs wouldn't allow that in. In the previous first tier, he got quite shirty about bringing in data relating to genetic damage in the children. So this is a definite advance. This one.
Certainly, and there's been some other. Go on. Sorry.
Well, so then he goes on in this document to say, with that brief background, Dr. Busby seeks disclosure from the Secretary of State for Defence of material that may be broadly defined as follows. 1. Data retained by AWE about the uranium content and ratios of uranium in the devices before detonation and the residues measured after explosion. And 2, similar data about other tests conducted by the UK or the USA after relevant periods of the appellant's presence at Maralinga, Christmas Island as a means of back calculation as the uranium content and ratios. 3, any data relating to test sites that may reveal the presence of other elements capable of causing risk to health that may not be reflected in a conventional dose assessment. So there we have tritium and carbon-14, you see, so he's taken that one on board. And finally, contemporary photographs of the relevant explosion, so we can see whether the fireball actually, or the shockwave, hits the ground sufficiently hard to create a lot of dust, which then gets sucked up with a lot of water from the sea, because these were over the sea, these explosions, which then goes up into the mushroom cloud and then rains down as black rain, like it did in Hiroshima, you see. So, I mean, this is really quite a good analysis of what it is I'm saying. And then he also says, nature of waste removed from Christmas Island around the time of independence of Kiribati, and then research data used in an academic study of the clusters of genetic disorders and illnesses.
Excellent.
So you know, this is like heavy stuff. I'm really impressed with that, Judge.
Yeah, no, it sounds like there's some fairness going on there. That's for sure.
Well, we certainly hope so. I mean, the other judge, Stubbs, was very fair, but the problem is that I never got my stuff in front of him. Whenever I did get my stuff in front of him, we won the case. But, you know, what happened was that they pushed me out in the previous first tier. So all of the stuff I was saying, which I'm now also saying to this judge, what was there in front of Hugh Stubbs, but it never got incorporated into the decision, you see. So that's why they lost the case.
Okay. And generally, just talking about the technical aspects, where are you going from here? When's the next court case? Has there been any delays?
No. Well, what's happening? Well, we put in our our expert reports around about October, and so they were supposed to put in their expert reports before this hearing, in fact. But in fact they didn't, and then they asked for an extension. They put in one of them, which was an enormous report, 280 pages, and then they said that they wanted to have another 6 weeks to get the other 2 reports in, which was like very strange. So we tried to say that we didn't want that; it was too long, and you know, we couldn't understand why they were doing it and this and that. But it looked like he accepted their argument that they had to have another 6 weeks to sort of digest whatever it was that the first expert was saying. So all that's happening, and then I have to ask Paddy Regan various questions, assuming Paddy Regan, you know, takes on this looking into the secret documents to see if he can find some way in which he can tell me what they say, which will enable me to run the case, and that's got to be done. So I've got to do that by the end of this month. And then they produce all their reports. Then we have to ask some questions about their reports, and then and then it all goes on like that. Then they ask us our experts questions about their reports, and then we put in all our final statement of claim. And each one of these things has a date, you know. So there will be another hearing where we're going with all of this, and ultimately we are having the actual trial, the tribunal hearing is scheduled for June 2016, and it's going to last 15 days. And I'm going to have to, I'm poor little Christopher, you know, age 70, poor Dada, is going to have to stand up in court and and do all his thing over 15 days in London. You know, I don't know, and with all on no money, of course, too. So I've got no mates in London that I can stay with at the moment because they've all bogged up to other places. So I'm going to have to sit in some crappy bed and breakfast place and stagger into the High Court every day to conduct this case. My mates, well, all right, my mates. Well, Andrew Ades lives in Cornwall and his wife is ill, so he can't come except occasionally. And then I've got Di Williams, who's helping me, you know, with a lot of the paperwork, but he's an old guy like me, and nobody's paying him either, you know, to do any of this, and he's doing tons and tons of photocopying and staggering it under the amount of paper involved in this, the actual trial bundle. I don't know, it's about 25 box files or something like that, and you've got to actually physically wheel this stuff into the court, you know. Oh, and he lives out of London, so he's got to come in on the train with his 25 box files and so forth. I mean, it's so unfair because the Secretary of State has got a whole kind of, he's got a ship full of people and millions of pounds to pay them, and they've got all their systems worked out and everything, and we're kind of doing this on zero money. Unbelievable it is, unbelievable.
Well, maybe a bit of a shout out for funding here. I mean, who do people contact for funding?
Well, low-level radiation campaign. We'll all do it. We're doing it all through that. So Richard Bramhall, he'll sort it all out. So if you go to the low-level radiation campaign, I think they've got a donate button. I don't know if it's working, but I've told them to try and see if it's working. But basically, just send a check to the address of Richard Bramhall, and write on the back of it for the test veterans.
Well, believe this
because the other thing we've got to do is we've got to fly our expert witnesses in from all four corners of the globe. We're bringing Soji Sawada in from Japan, so we've got to bring him all that way. And we can't bring him cattle class. I mean, he's like 80 years old. So we've got to bring him sort of in reasonable luxury, or he'll probably die on the flight. Anyway, I mean, it's a bit of a laugh.
So basically, what we're doing on the article, we'll put up LLRC address and also a phone number for Richard Bramhall if people would like to contact him direct and organise something else.
Well, they can phone me. I'm quite happy to talk to anybody about all of this, And in fact, of course, they can send the money to me if they want to. Sure. I mean, it will all go into one pot, so that we have it all in one place, so we know what we can do and how much we can do and what we can't do and everything,
And where's the website that people can get your phone number from, your contact details?
I think it's on Green Audit, actually. I think it's on www.greenoudit.org.
.org, right?
Yeah.
Green Audit.
Yeah.
All right. So we'll put the Green Audit. We'll put the LLRC links in.
Yeah.
And it's quite important because we're challenging the ICRP dose model here, and it's a big first. It sounds like the scope you've been given has expanded, and the judge's points that he's made should really get you those documents, even the one from the university, because it would be very suspicious if they carried on trying to stop you getting to those documents before the June.
Well, they're going to argue that it's a question of confidentiality, and that because of course we're not asking for anybody's name, so the documents are basically the questionnaires, and we just say, well, give us the questionnaires, but just rub out the names with a felt tip, so we can't see who the guy's name is. But then they say, well, you might be able to distinguish who the person is on the basis of their where they were at what time, or it's just not really believable.
You'll just be running off basic statistics.
That's all. I mean, so what we'll do is we'll take all of their questionnaires and we'll put them into an Excel file, and there'll just be a list of how many people that answered the questionnaire, and there'll be a list of how many people who've got hydrocephalus and spina bifida, and then you just add them all up and you say, well, okay, there were let's say, I think there are 2,000 responses, and there were 150, hydrocephalus, and if you look at the normal rate in the population of that age at the time, there should only have been 3, So it's really
so
quite
basically, the university's complaints are basically sort of, not worth the whatever it's.
No, absolutely. But that's also the case at the moment for cancer registries too. They won't tell you how many people in a small area close to a nuclear plant suffered from leukemia. And when you say, well, why? They say, oh, well, because you might be able to identify them. I mean, if you knew that, in an area where there were 2,500 people, they are really actually saying, well, and there were 2 leukemias. And the fact that you knew that there were 2 leukemias there and not 3 would enable you to be able to figure out, who the person was that had leukemia. And then you go around and say, ha ha, I know that you've got leukemia, ha ha. I mean, it's just absurd.
No, totally. So, all right. So, I mean, the bottom line is the fact that they use those excuses to stop independent, epidemiologists trying to access the data and make something of them, I mean, we certainly saw in Japan Professor Suda, who basically got the data that was just sitting there and he was the only person in 4 years that bothered to actually look at the data. And the data clearly proved there's a connection between a nuclear accident in Fukushima Daiichi and sort of thyroid cancers in young people. So we need independent epidemiologists to get this data. And even in Japan, an independent the epidemiologist was able to get to the data. In the UK, totally different thing though, yeah?
Well, in Japan, the same. I mean, he got the data because they were doing these thyroid surveys with ultrasound. But there is also data about the number of children with leukemia near Fukushima, but they're not going to let you have that. They're not going to let anybody have that, or brain tumors, or heart attacks, or whatever, you know. All that data exists in Japan, but it's secret.
Well, they made it secret in 2013 when they brought in their new...
No, it's always been secret. It's always been secret.
Right.
For incidents, you can sometimes get mortality data, but once you get down to small areas, that more or less there's collusion between all the cancer registries in the world now since about 1990 to not allow out any information on incidents in small areas. They won't do it.
That's right. Yeah.
I managed to get the Michael Meacher, the late Michael Meacher, who was a sort of mate of mine. I got him to push the cancer registries again, and they kept saying, oh, well, you know, the numbers are so small, so you won't be able to. So I told him to ask them for 10 years of data, all right? So, like, maybe, you know, if the numbers are small in 1 year, you can ask for 10 years and add it all together. So we want to know, close to the nuclear site, how many leukemias in 10 years, you know, and then further away from the nuclear site, how many leukemias in 10 years. So they couldn't pull that thing about confidentiality because the numbers were small. So at that point he was sacked. You know, he was kicked. Tony Blair sacked him. I think that was the reason he was sacked, actually, because he was homing in on this issue of small area cancer data.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, he did some good stuff, I have to say.
Yeah, he was a great guy.
All right. Anyway, on that note, I'd like to thank you, Chris Busby, for such an interesting sort of update on what's been happening. And we'll definitely be covering this in the future. The links and everything will be put onto an article. I'll pop this up onto SoundCloud now, and I'll work on an article, and then I'll start posting that around everywhere and let people know what's going on. Thank you.
Okay, Sean. Thank you for allowing me to say this. I think it's important that the test veterans know what's going on, you know, and that somebody gives them a rough idea of where we're going with all this and how well it's going. It is going quite well.